Greetings everyone. This evening we are exploring the diet of a historical icon, Alexander the Great. He, the individual who subdued a significant portion of the known globe prior to reaching 33 years, managed wild steeds as an adolescent, and nonchalantly established cities as though playing an ancient version of SimCity, nonetheless confronted the daily query of his morning meal. Cana, was it spit roasted lamb in a gilded vessel, simmered lentils within a combatant's shelter, or merely anything that failed to scurry away swiftly? Before we delve into his majestic food provisions, please briefly like this video and subscribe, but solely if you truly appreciate my work here, okay? And inform me via comments about your viewing location and the current time. I delight in discovering who is observing this at 2 in the morning, consuming cereal directly from his packaging like an authentic military leader. Now, lower the illumination. Perhaps switch on a cooling device for that gentle ambient drone. Let us gradually commence this evening's exploration collectively. Prior to becoming Alexander the Great, he was Alexander urged to eat his gruel, far preceding empire construction, global subjugation, and lamentations across 3 major land masses. Youthful Alexander of Macedon commenced his mornings similarly to all other aristocratic youths, with a first meal that was determinedly nourishing and dubiously challenging to masticate. Envision a cool Macedonian dawn. Daylight has not yet broken, nor has Aristotle arisen. Yet the culinary area bustles with the noises of simmering barley and individuals feigning that its flavor has improved today. The morning meal for young Alexander probably comprised boiled barley gruel, a more refined term for warm, somewhat saline pulp. At times, it could have been enhanced by a dash of goat's milk, or during a festive occasion, a desiccated fig appearing to have endured some ordeal. Alongside this vaporous container of gentle despondency, bread would be present, likely crafted from emmer or barley meal, coarse in consistency and fundamentally against airiness. It was the type of bread that met your gaze, harbored resentments, and served as a makeshift weapon during political unrest. Olives also featured, as nothing epitomizes a childhood breakfast quite like acrid, greasy fruit steeped in saline solution. And if fortune favored you, meaning an aristocratic lineage with at least one living progenitor, a segment of goat cheese matured to a state of aggressive pungency and potent enough to clear nasal passages from afar might be provided to accompany everything. Wine, indeed, even for a child. However, restrain your enthusiasm to a significantly watered down, essentially violet-tinted liquid. Macedonians considered unadulterated wine consumption suitable for uncivilized people and poets of questionable discretion. This sounds modest, and it truly was. Yet, it was not due to a scarcity of means at the Macedonian royal court. Absolutely not. Alexander's sire, Philip II, intentionally nurtured his heir within a framework of moderation. No opulence, no indulgence, merely energy, protein, and the mental shaping of an individual who would eventually consume campaign provisions in Persia unhesitatingly. Consequently, no gilded flapjacks, no regal eggs benedict only pulp, olives, and bread so compact it could support a failing pillar. Breakfast, the initial victory of each day. Royal court was deficient in means. No, Alexander's progenitor, Philip II, intentionally nurtured his offspring within a framework of discipline. No opulence, no leniency, merely sustenance, protein, and the mental preparation of an individual poised to consume campaign provisions in Persia without hesitation. Thus, no gilded crepes, no regal eggs, benedicted only, semi-liquid food, olives, and bread so compact it might prop up a disintegrating pillar. The morning meal, the day's initial triumph. Picture yourself preparing for your midday meal, and opposite you sits Aristotle, thinker, man of science, and constant downer regarding excessive consumption. You merely desire to savor your barley loaf and perhaps a dried fruit while he delivers a lecture on temperance amidst mouthfuls of lentil pottage. Alexander, in his adolescent years, wasn't solely acquiring swordsmanship skills. His education encompassed ethics, logical reasoning, persuasive speech, and likely identifying comestibles that induced lethargy, hindering Asian conquest. Aristotle, a follower of Plato, an advocate for equilibrium in every aspect, assumed personal accountability for ensuring Alexander's physique and intellect received equal nourishment, although perhaps not equal contentment. Mealtimes served as occasions for moral enhancement. If one reached for an additional piece of cheese, Aristotle would probably arch a brow and nonchalantly remark on how overeating blunts the spirit and clouds the intellect. Enjoyable moments. However, this was not mere rigid dietary criticism. Aristotle maintained that nutrition was pivotal in molding rulers. Insufficient amounts led to weakness, excessive amounts to decadence. A balance yielded an empire and a strong constitution. Alexander likely discerned the distinction between sustenance for energy and food for ostentation through these teachings. Unpretentious pulses, such as lentils, were deemed beneficial for the spirit. A remarkable notion given their flavor profile resembles letdown unless robustly flavored. Conversely, items overly sweet, piquant, or opulent were regarded with distrust, as though capable of debasing one's principles and leading to indolent luxury by evening. There is also a certain paradox in food's transformation into an instructional medium. Most children learned their letters by inscribing on waxen slates. Alexander was likely interrogated about Hippocrates' views on wine dilution and the potential for figs to incite unchaste notions. This culinary doctrine remained with him even when faced with the finest Persian gastronomy: lamb prepared with pomegranate syrup, rice so aromatic it bordered on illicit. Alexander frequently adhered to simple fare: bread, meat, water, occasionally some olives during uninhibited moments. Therefore, no midday meals with Aristotle were not enjoyable. Yet, they were shaping. Alexander not only mastered city subjugation, he mastered declining further helpings, and that, in ancient Macedon, signified leadership. If you have ever assembled a lunch with affection, optimism, and precisely a single piece of dry bread, felicitations. You might already meet the criteria for a Macedonian campaign cook. Typical midday repast in ancient Macedon was not centered on taste. It revolved around avoiding collapse under the sun while exclaiming military phrases. Alexander's regular lunch, particularly preceding his military expeditions, would have been unassuming to the degree of severity. We are discussing a coarse segment of barley or emmer bread, desiccated to the firmness of a ceramic slab. This was the sort of bread one had to merit the privilege of chewing, ideally with a knife and a supplication. Complementing this firm foundation of the meal were several local delicacies: goat cheese that endured travel well but possessed an odor suggesting combativeness, and onions, which were virtually a primary food item in Macedon. Onions were believed to enhance vigor and stamina, and clearly unfortunate breath diplomacy. One might also receive a petite sack of figs or dried dates. It's contingent on the time of year and whether the provision convoy had eluded wolf predation. These fruits represented the ancient era's form of confection: chewy, adhesive, and possessing a consistency somewhere between cured hide and remorse. For protein, salted or dried flesh might be available, usually goat or beef, occasionally boar if they had recently plundered a sophisticated party. It lacked succulence. It lacked tenderness. It was the type of meat that challenged you to asphyxiate on it and prevail. In their beverage, if fortunate, diluted wine. Otherwise, tepid water from a leather canteen that had spent the majority of the day steeping in perspiration and saddle grime. It's invigorating. Technically, It is noteworthy that Alexander consumed identical fare as his troops. He did not dispatch for unusual spices or demand hand-peeled grapes. No, he positioned himself on the ground, tore off a portion of stone-like bread, and masticated like a man endeavoring to inspire an empire using solely his mandibular power. So, when discussing the Macedonian lunch container, do not imagine an appealing bento arrangement. Envision a Hessian pouch of calories that disliked you just sufficiently to sustain your life utilitarian. Brutal, much like the man himself. Dinner with one's father is already a strained event during adolescence. Now, envision your father as King Philip II of Macedon, an individual who managed diplomacy, conflict, and a minimum of 7 spouses, as if it were a competitive endeavor. Welcome to mealtime at the royal board, where the sustenance was heated and the discussions could result in banishment. Philip's dinners were probably lavish by Macedonian norms, yet still significantly different from Romanesque overindulgence. Substantial roasted meats, pottages dense with lentils, boiled cereals, and a flagon of wine that had witnessed much. The man was notoriously partial to his drink. Historical accounts discreetly term him a heavy drinker. That is ancient biographer language, for your father is intoxicated again. Alexander, conversely, frequently abstained or drank moderately, not due to a dislike for wine, but because Philip tended to combine statecraft with his Pinot, and young Alexander was already maneuvering around him like a miniature strategist. Nothing diminishes one's appetite like observing your father negotiate a military pact between bites of seared lamb. And the dialogue, intense. You have military counselors debating territories, poets declaiming verses between swallows of stew, and philosophers casually trading insults in ancient Greek. All this while, Alexander composedly eats his cheese and schemes to eventually surpass his father in conquest, which he decidedly did. Incidentally, periodically, Philip would introduce exotic components or culinary preparations from other Hellenic regions, spiced fish, sweetened baked goods, or peculiar herbs that caused a lingual tingling. Alexander sampled them. He offered courteous remarks, but consistently reverted to the fundamentals: bread, meat, wine, sturdy, reliable, advantageous for empire construction. The emotional dimension of these dinners, let's just acknowledge, therapy, was not yet conceived. Philip served as both an exemplar and an intense, sandal-wearing nuisance. Their bond was a mixture of affection and gladiatorial contest. During one dinner, Alexander even departed angrily after Philip, inebriated, insulted him. The atmosphere was that unfavorable. And this occurred before an assassination attempt on Philip with a spear. So yes, dinner with his father was formative. It refined Alexander's political acumen, fortified his determination, and likely instilled in him a permanent preference for tranquil meals with fewer risks of stabbing. Now, let us discuss Alexander en route. Not just any route, but the kind that extends through searing deserts, snow-afflicted mountain passes, and, at times, over the smoldering remnants of your adversaries. What is on the menu for this picturesque journey? Delightful portion of desperation accompanied by tactical sustenance. Field provisions in Alexander's military were not designed for taste. They were intended for survival, maneuverability, and, ideally, not to kill you mid-march. Envision a linen satchel containing barley bread, onions, and desiccated meat ingredients that were travel-hardy, exceptionally durable, and nearly spiteful in their consistency. The bread, dense, firm, unflavored. You could masticate it without fracturing a tooth. Congratulations, you were suitable for duty. These loaves also functioned as cutlery, bucklers, and, in dire situations, objects of emotional comfort. Warmed over a campfire, they could almost be considered edible. Cold, one would sooner bite a stone. Meat, when procurable, was salted beyond recognition: goat, lamb, or beef, thinly sliced, sun-dried, and salted until it became more mineral than muscle. this was not jerky. Key, this was ancient dental examination material. Key, it preserved well, however, and if soaked sufficiently in water or wine, it might even become pliable. Onions and garlic were regular companions, not for their enjoyment, but because they were inexpensive, strong-smelling, and thought to enhance endurance. Nothing declares I am prepared for combat like breath so potent it clears a phalanx. For hydration, there was diluted wine, insufficient to cause inebriation, but just enough to make the water taste less of saddle leather and regret. Pure water was seldom safe, particularly when 700 miles into Persia and the local watercourses were actively being cursed. There were exceptions. Occasionally, following a triumph, Alexander permitted a feast, roasted animals, flatbreads with herbs, wine that did not taste of boiled sandals. But these were infrequent and invariably succeeded by another arduous march. It was never opulence, for opulence's sake, was recompense with an inherent return to austerity. So yes, field rations were not fine dining, but they kept you alive, vigilant, and just resentful enough to confront the subsequent empire, and Alexander consumed the same. Not from necessity, but from his conviction that no individual merited superior food than his army. Imagine this. You have marched for days through scorching heat. Your footwear is essentially leather regrets, and your throat feels as if personally cursed by Helios, the sun deity. Abruptly, a soldier discovers a scant puddle, not a spring, not a brook, just a muddy, likely frog-inhabited puddle, and ladles the water into his helmet. Now, the historical element begins. That soldier presents it to Alexander, the king of kings, vanquisher of Persian forces, conqueror of realms. He simply gazes at the water, expresses gratitude to the man, and then pours it onto the earth before everyone. It remains one of the most emblematic and dramatically arid instances in Alexander's existence. Not due to what he consumed, but due to what he abstained from. But let us pause. Why a helmet? Because in the ancient era, cooking implements were discretionary, but helmets were obligatory. It served as your drinking vessel, your basin, your head protection, your emergency commode. Versatile, effective, somewhat unhygienic. Alexander's action was not about staying hydrated. It was performance. Art aimed at boosting morale. If he, the most potent man alive, would not drink until everyone possessed water, then you, the infantryman with sunburn and trench foot, could also endure. Was the water potable? Likely not. Ancient armies lacked advanced filtration systems, but that was immaterial. In a single, fluid movement, Alexander transformed dehydration into a team-building exercise. It resembles a corporate trust fall, only dustier and involving more sandals. And the tale endured. Writers like Arrian and Plutarch were captivated by it, because here was a leader who governed not merely by tactics, but by demonstrative suffering. He experienced hunger when they did. He walked as they did, and when the sole available water appeared to originate from a donkey's hoofprint, he still declined to drink before his soldiers. It is, frankly, ingenious. Anyone can partake in a feast, but abstaining from drink with someone, that is psychological warfare. So, the next time you sip bottled water and lament its temperature, recall Alexander, who once observed a helmet of tepid frog broth and declared, "No, thank you, I shall wait," and his army revered him for it. Subduing an empire carries certain advantages. Among them, culinary improvements. When Alexander advanced into Persia, he was met not only by quivering aristocrats and deserted royal residences, but also by banquets so opulent they made Macedonian bread resemble gravel on a serviette. Persian gastronomy was serious. These were the individuals who introduced the world to rice, pilaf, saffron, stewed lamb with pomegranate syrup, and approximately 47 varieties of sweets that all sounded vaguely like honeyed bricks. Their royal feasts were architectural marvels, golden platters, crystal ewers, exotic fruits arranged like pyramids, and sufficient roasted meats to alarm a small woodland. And then there is Alexander, monarch of unrefined porridge and philosophical moderation, entering this culinary hallucination. It was akin to placing a Spartan in a gourmet emporium. Did he partake? Occasionally. It was not impervious. Sources indicate he did sample the saffron rice, the date-stuffed pastries, and the wine so potent it required its own chart. Yet, overall, he maintained a remarkably modest diet. He still favored bread, meat, and water over any bejeweled stew or gold-dusted fig. This was not merely personal inclination. It was a declaration to Alexander. Excessive indulgence signified weakness, and weakness, in his philosophy, resulted in lost empires. So, while Persian nobles reclined on silk cushions, savoring stuffed quail, Alexander continued to chew on his reliable barley biscuit, likely wishing it possessed more existential fortitude. He did, however, permit his men to enjoy the spoils. After years of dust and boiled goat, they merited a night or 12 of feasting. Roast lamb, grilled fish, honey cakes, all presented on dishes so elaborate they probably had their own legacy plans. But Alexander remained circumspect. He had observed the fate of leaders who allowed luxury to become too entrenched. A soft midsection made a poor defense on the battlefield. That stated, he was not entirely unaffected. A few Persian ingredients, such as rosewater and cinnamon, reportedly found their way into his meals. Flavor, after all, was not disloyalty. Yes, Persia offered a lavish spread, and Alexander sampled it. But ultimately, he still dined like a man with deserts to traverse, foes to pursue, and a profound suspicion of anything that glittered on a plate. Alexander never actually shared a meal with Darius III, but he certainly dined because of him. After pursuing the Persian monarch across Asia like the planet's most persistent food delivery agent, Alexander eventually inherited more than just his royal seat. He acquired his entire culinary operation. We are discussing a royal kitchen enterprise on an immense scale. Darius did not travel with a mere few cooks in a single pot. He journeyed with hundreds of chefs, bakers, spice specialists, and professional food tasters whose role was essentially consume this in case it fatally harms the king. It was less a camp and more a Michelin-starred military procession. When Darius absconded, leaving his dining pavilion behind, Alexander stepped into a realm of opulence previously exclusive to immortals and individuals with exceptionally delicate self-esteems, gold-plated dinnerware, tables laden with slow-roasted lamb, saffron rice, grilled fish enveloped in fig leaves, and sauces aged longer than most Macedonian soldiers. How did Alexander respond? Well, like a man reared on onions and doubt, he sat rigidly upright, purportedly disregarded the couches, and ate in silence while everyone around him reclined and attempted to avoid eye contact with the exceedingly intense conqueror. No slouching, no lounging, just masticating with determination and possibly disapproval. Teasing. It was deliberate communication. Alexander was not about to be found engaging in Persian princely imitation. He desired everyone, particularly former Persian nobles now uncomfortably pledging their allegiance, to understand he remained Macedonian, still disciplined, and still entirely capable of overturning the table if matters became too indulgent. Yet, let us not imagine he failed to appreciate the assortment. Sources note that Alexander adopted certain Persian dining practices, such as multi-course meals and the infrequent floral-infused wine. He was not above valuing good food. He was merely above requiring it. So, no, he did not dine with Darius in the conventional meaning, but he dined in Darius's position, with Darius's cutlery, surrounded by Darius's intimidated chefs, which, in a sense, was even more gratifying. After all, retribution is a dish optimally served on a golden platter, with a side of roasted goat and political supremacy. Alexander the Great was renowned for numerous achievements: tactical genius, relentless ambition, global supremacy before turning 33. But tonight's subject, wine, an abundance of wine, sufficient wine to make Dionysus remark, perhaps, moderate your pace. Despite his customary self-control, there were instances, rare, dramatic, and somewhat sorrowful, when Alexander fully embraced the drinking vessel. The most notorious of these events occurred in Persia, when the triumphant hero, enveloped in luxury and numerous overly agreeable individuals, organized a colossal, flamboyantly lavish banquet. What was offered? Likely an overwhelming array of Persian dainties: roasted lamb, rice pilafs, spiced fruits, date confections, and wine dispensed as if it were indebted. There were toasts, lengthy ones, heartfelt ones, possibly ones incorporating dramatic recitations of Homer and lamentations about Achilles. Then the incident transpired. Following many rounds of increasingly muddled diplomacy, Alexander, reportedly inebriated, yet still majestic, resolved to incinerate the royal palace at Persepolis. The reason, historians continue to debate. Some propose it was symbolic. Others suggest it was vengeance. A minority suspect it was an intoxicated dare instigated by his equally inebriated companions. You understand the scenario a bit too much. Fermented grape juice, and suddenly you are setting fire to a global marvel. Alexander awoke with the ancient counterpart of a hangover, and his somewhat scorched empire might be the earliest documented instance of post-wine remorse in military annals. This was not a singular case of tipsy governance. Other accounts mention altercations erupting after banquets, including one tragic evening when Alexander, in an inebriated fury, killed his close associate Cletus, the same individual who had previously saved his life in combat. That specific night concluded with emesis, tears, and a profound existential crisis. Merely a typical Friday in Babylon. The lesson, for a man so fixated on control, alcohol was his singular vulnerability, and the more triumphs he achieved, the more challenging it became to prevent the wine and the sycophants from overflowing. So yes, Alexander occasionally drank excessively, and when he did, he was not a monarch or a deity. He was simply a highly intoxicated man with a very poor sense of proportion and, credibly, access to firebrands. Advancing into India was not merely a geopolitical action. It was a culinary challenge for Alexander and his weary, flatbread, nourished soldiers. They had traversed scorching deserts and plodded through icy mountain routes. Now, they confronted spices they could not articulate and creatures resembling siege engines with tusks. Gastronomically, India was an eye-opener. This was a territory of lentils, rice, ginger, turmeric, tamarind, and sufficient chili-like heat to transform a Macedonian soldier's helmet into a sauna. Ancient sources, though imprecise and somewhat awestruck, detail how the army met entirely new tastes: curries, aromatic stews, and vegetables not merely boiled until listless. Alexander reportedly found it agreeable. Despite his preference for austerity, he was inquisitive, flexible, and adequately self-aware to realize one does not disparage local food while still technically invading. He sampled their cuisine, honored their customs. He did not, however, master cooking. That remained strictly another's responsibility. His men, conversely, did not adapt as smoothly. Macedonian soldiers were conditioned for meat, bread, and ill humor. Spiced lentils and unfamiliar fruits were met with distrust, or in some instances, public grievances, loud enough to startle the elephants. It is rumored many soldiers began to long for good old barley stew. One can indeed term barley stew good. Then arrived the elephants, not for consumption, mind you, but as battlefield adversaries. Alexander, Ever the pragmatist, likely, observed a war elephant and remarked, "All right, we are not consuming that, but we are definitely enlisting a few." Nevertheless, Indian hospitality included tables laden with richly seasoned dishes, goats simmered in spices, fried breads, date, confections. Even if Alexander adhered to modest servings, he could not overlook the profuse generosity. Indeed, some accounts assert he dispatched food back to his troops to boost morale, which is ancient general terminology for here. Try this and cease your lamenting. Ultimately, India broadened more than just the empire's frontiers. It broadened their palates, their spice endurance, and their emergency lavatory arrangements. And for a man who once deemed a salted onion lunch sufficient, this constituted progress. You can conquer Persia, march through Egypt, cross into India, and dine with kings, but eventually the lentil always finds you. For Alexander, no matter how far he wandered or how many golden feasts were laid before him, he kept circling back to the culinary equivalent of a shrug. Boiled lentils, humble, unpretentious, and textured somewhere between mushy gravel and warm skepticism. Lentils were his dietary North Star. Was this because he loved lentils? Probably not. No child's dreams of one day ruling the world while munching on lukewarm legumes. The lentils were practical, nutritious, and most importantly, politically neutral. They didn't scream luxury, didn't stir envy, and didn't cause diplomatic incidents. They were just there, like sandals, or your most loyal but boring advisor. In a world of exotic foods and dangerous banquets, lentils were safe. They didn't come from suspicious sources. They didn't require translation, and they certainly didn't lead to palace arson. See why. Chapter 9. For a ruler who slept with a dagger under his pillow. This was ideal cuisine. Historically, lentils had long been a staple in the Greek and Macedonian diet, high in protein, easy to store, and cookable with just a pot, fire, and low expectations. Add a little vinegar or oil, maybe some crushed garlic if you're feeling fancy, and voila, the ancient version of "I'm too tired to cook." Some sources suggest that even in Babylon, with access to every spice, roast, and delicacy imaginable, Alexander still requested simple meals, and lentils, of course, made the short list. It wasn't a punishment. It was philosophy, a nod to discipline, and maybe a subtle flex. I could eat honeyed quail wrapped in gold leaf, but I choose mushy brown pulses. It's also likely that lentils reminded him of home, of training in the Macedonian hills, of dinners with Aristotle where the food came with moral lessons, and of military camps where the only thing consistent was the sound of chewing something slightly tragic. So yes, the lentil returned, not with a fanfare, but with a quiet plop into a wooden bowl, and Alexander, emperor of half the known world, picked up a spoon and ate. Because even greatness needs fiber. When you envision royal refreshments, you might picture grapes peeled by nervous attendants, or fine pastries presented on silver salvers, while a harpist performed something emotionally intricate nearby. However, for Alexander the Great, snacking was not quite as picturesque. Predominantly, snacks were eaten while on horseback, supervising a siege, or nonchalantly redrawing the map of the recognized world. Test practicality was paramount. Snack suitability was assessed not by taste, but by its ability to endure being dropped in a saddlebag, trodden on by a horse, and remain technically edible. To the dried figs, olives, roasted chickpeas, nuts, and substantial pieces of aged goat cheese, so solid they could serve as missiles. These constituted the granola bars of the ancient era, compact, durable, and emotionally detached. Dried figs were a particular favorite, portable, sticky, and rich in sugar and energy. They provided Alexander with a rapid surge of vitality, useful when conquering cities before lunchtime. Olives were saline, oily, and notorious for staining tunics at awkward diplomatic junctures. But, hey, electrolytes, roasted chickpeas, meanwhile, were the popcorn of ancient times, crunchy, fulfilling, and abundant, though regrettably unbuttered, and nuts, particularly almonds and walnuts, supplied protein, fat, something to masticate while contemplating whether to traverse another mountain range. Alexander's commanders probably carried similar provisions, sometimes enveloped in fabric, or kept in small leather satchels. No Tupperware, no hermetically sealed containers, just dust-coated finger food distributed between sword skirmishes. And naturally, road dust was ever present. Not consumed deliberately, but practically inescapable. Everything bore a coating. Of it, the bread, the meat, the figs. There's a reason ancient armies were slender. They were perpetually chewing on sand and feigning it was seasoning. Some narratives even imply that Alexander, despite access to superior items, frequently opted to eat like his soldiers. He wished to avoid appearing aloof or coddled, and snacking on goat cheese while seated on a rock with your troops, that is fundamental ancient military relatability. So, no, royal snacks were not extravagant. They were resilient, functional, and primarily flavored by the Saronians, which for Alexander tasted of ambition, road detritus, and the occasional fig. Every empire experiences its moments of culinary extravagance, and Alexander's conquests were no different. While his everyday meals were frequently sensible and plain, there were sporadic banquets, especially following victories, where matters became peculiar. Not past the salt peculiar, more like, is that a fire-breathing performer? Peculiar. Victory feasts were a blend of diplomatic display and caloric indulgence. You would encounter Persian nobles attempting not to weep into their golden serviettes, Macedonian soldiers questioning if honeyed lizard was a jest, and Alexander presiding over it all, endeavoring to prevent events from devolving into interpretative, wine-induced conflict. These banquets featured roasted animals, too large for a single table, bowls of pomegranate-drenched rice, pastries shaped like birds, and wine poured by men adorned with more jewelry than attire. Live entertainment was also present. Music, poetry, acrobats, possibly an elephant or two performing something symbolic and vaguely menacing. But the true disorder arrived with the toasts. In Macedonian custom, drinking was not merely encouraged, it was practically a weaponized activity. Men would attempt to out-toast each other in wine volume and emotional discourse. Commence with to Alexander and concluded with someone exclaiming, "I would perish for your sandals," while weeping into a leg of lamb. One of the most renowned banquets Canori transpired in Samarkand, where Alexander endeavored to fuse Macedonian and Persian traditions by having both peoples feast together as equals. A splendid notion, a logistical catastrophe, language obstacles, cultural misinterpretations, canned. The reality that Persian cuisine incorporated sauces, while Macedonian cuisine deemed salt an extravagance. It was destined to culminate in someone overturning a platter. Occasionally, the peculiarity was inadvertent, such as when Alexander hosted a banquet in a recently conquered city that still smelled of smoke, or when individuals presented extravagant tribute dishes, live peacocks, honey-glazed camel allegedly, or a pudding necessitating 6 servants in divine forbearance. These feasts were more than mere meals. They were political declarations, unity spectacles, morale enhancers, sporadic lessons in why one should not permit the individual from Thrace near the wine amphora. So yes, Alexander could organize a festivity, but even then, he often ate moderately, drank prudently, and observed everything like a man cognizant that history was perpetually recording. By the period Alexander arrived in Babylon, he was not merely a monarch. He was a global phenomenon with a diet now incorporating elements from Greece, Persia, India, and whatever that item was, they roasted in Bactria. Babylon, naturally, extended a grand welcome. And by grand welcome, we mean feasts that made Olympic. Opening ceremonies resembled casual get-togethers. This was the culinary zenith of his expedition. Babylonian chefs were virtuosos of opulence. They possessed access to grain-fed lamb, spiced date wine, cooked fruits, and limitless sauces, all served with panache and typically on something golden. Meals arrived in successive courses accompanied by music, incense, and the subtle aroma of either triumph or fatigue, perhaps both. Alexander's table had now become a geopolitical occasion, with Persian satraps, Indian envoys, Greek generals, and probably a philosopher or two, feigning they were not profoundly uneasy with cumin, seated beside him. Yet, despite the pageantry, Alexander still consumed simply most of the time. He did not overindulge. He did not adorn himself with honey. He maintained his old customs bred meat, perhaps a little wine even, as peacocks stuffed with dates were paraded by. This was partly discipline, partly political communication. Yes, I govern the world, but I remain humble enough to chew jerky like a common soldier. And then transpired the ultimate feast. Counts differ greatly, as ancient historians were not precisely renowned for verifying facts. But most concur. Alexander attended a massive banquet, possibly in tribute to a deity, a companion, or merely for surviving another Thursday. There was sustenance, was a great deal of wine, and sometime thereafter he became unwell. Was it poison? A fever, malaria, liver failure from years of high-functioning global domination? We shall never ascertain. What we do know is that for 11 days, Alexander remained confined to bed, incapable of speaking, eating, or rising. The man who had consumed continents could scarcely sip water. No detailed record of his final meal exists. It was probably not lavish. It might have been a cup of wine or just a moist cloth on his lips. Ultimately, the conqueror of empires met the fate of all mortals, quietly, humbly, and possibly hungry. Thus concluded the feasting. Thus concluded the man. And in Babylon, the banquet tables were cleared, and history assumed its place. Let us envision, just briefly, that Alexander the Great materialized in the contemporary, eerie, dusty cloak. Sword at his hip, somewhat bewildered by escalators, found himself queuing at a food court. What would he select? To be unambiguous, Alexander was not a man for frivolities. He did not tolerate indecisiveness, and he certainly disbelieved in assemble-your-own-bowl concepts. He would survey the choices: fusion tacos, multicolored smoothies, deep-fried everything, and likely opt for something straightforward, transportable, canned protein, dash-rich. He would bypass the sugar-coated, trendy items and probably proceed directly to a lamb gyro, nodding with approval at the roasting meat rotating like a miniature war chariot. Barley-based energy bars, familiar terrain. Lentil, soupa, nostalgic preference. Grilled onions, yes, but only if the aroma reminded him of conquest and poor impulse control. Fast food would perplex him, but its military-like efficiency might persuade him. The notion of food being prepared in under 2 minutes would have seemed like sorcery in Macedon, though he would probably wish to examine the kitchen and possibly conquer it. If compelled to navigate a modern menu, he would pose questions. Why is this designated a Caesar salad? Was he not assassinated in the Forum? Why is this chicken general so? What military force did he lead? And upon tasting a milkshake, this is delightful. What creature did you milk to obtain sugar? Regarding health, he would likely flourish. His original diet low in carbohydrates, high in walking 20 miles before breakfast was already influenced on doors to paleo. He essentially conceived it. Keto. Tata's merely campaign season. Yet, despite all this novelty, Alexander would likely still yearn for simplicity. A flatbread, some roasted meat, a cup of wine mixed, naturally, because he was not a barbarian. No glittering cupcakes, no avocado toast. Definitely no food served in a mason jar. Why? Because Alexander was not merely a man of appetite. He was a man of intent. Food was sustenance, an instrument, occasionally a morale enhancer, but never the primary focus. So, if you ever find yourself deliberating your order while feeling profoundly indecisive, simply ask yourself, would Alexander consume this, or would he annex it? And suddenly, that lentil wrap might not appear so uninteresting after all. In the declining eras of the ancient world, when the Mediterranean's foremost intellects still convened beneath porticos and debated the universe's nature, a woman named Hypatia occupied a central position. Born around 360 CE in the intellectual crucible of Alexandria, she was not predestined to lead according to the era's conventions. Yet, there she was, not merely engaging in philosophy and science, but excelling within them. Her father, Theon, was an esteemed mathematician and philosopher linked with the Great Museum of Alexandria, a learning institution still resonating with the diminishing legacy of the once mighty library. But while most fathers instructed their sons in reading and writing, Theon fully invested in his daughter. He educated Hypatia in arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and Platonic philosophy. She did not just commit theories to memory, she scrutinized them, argued them, and imparted them. By the time she attained adulthood, Hypatia had surpassed her father in both intellectual capacity and societal sway. Her lectures attracted students from all corners of the empire, pagans, Christians, skeptics, and zealots alike. She taught openly in thoroughfares and lecture chambers, attired in her philosopher's mantle, commanding notice not through dominance, but through lucidity. Elucidated celestial mechanics, conic sections, and numerical properties with such brilliance that people depicted her as almost godlike. And this was not some secluded academic concealed in musty chambers. Hypatia navigated freely through the male-centric society of late Roman Egypt, providing counsel to city administrators and even Roman governors. She personified the old world, the classical world, one that was rapidly receding beneath the currents of religious change and imperial fragility. But Alexandria was no longer merely a city of texts. It was also a battleground of beliefs. Christianity ascending, paganism declining, and politics growing more perilous than any mathematical problem. Hypatia's renown, her autonomy, and her stature as an emblem of rational classical reasoning, began to provoke envy and bitterness among those who favored revelation over rationality. Nevertheless, in those initial years, she remained inviolable. Hypatia was the ultimate illumination of a fading epoch, a woman esteemed not for conforming to the male world, but for transcending it significantly. In an era when women were anticipated to wed, raise offspring, and remain distant from academic auditoriums, Hypatia undertook something profoundly defiant. She opted for an intellectual existence. And crucially, Alexandria permitted her to some extent. Her very presence was unconventional, yet her intellect rendered disagreement with her challenging. Hypatia did not forcibly enter intellectual spheres. She received invitations. Her proficiency in mathematics and astronomy positioned her at the vanguard of Neoplatonism, a philosophical current merging Plato's doctrines with mystical components. Envision elevated concepts regarding the soul's progression, ultimate realities, nature, and the continuum between the material and the divine, all articulated with geometric exactitude. Hypatia's lectures were not merely dry academic affairs. Either her reputation was compelling. Students arrived not only from Alexandria, but from every region of the empire, keen to learn from her. Many were upper-class Roman men who, paradoxically, acquired knowledge of logic and discipline from a woman their own societies would have suppressed. She instructed publicly, not clandestinely. She traversed the city in her philosopher's attire, capturing attention in forums and amphitheaters, frequently delivering orations before diverse audiences. It was not solely her erudition that enthralled, it was her persona. Hypatia was famously austere, indifferent to riches or sensual gratification. She remained unwed, perhaps intentionally to preserve her autonomy and philosophical immaculateness, according to one narrative, likely uncorroborated, but nonetheless indicative. When a student attempted a romantic pursuit, she rebuffed him by hurling a bloody minstrel cloth at him, proclaiming, "This is what you desire, young man, not beauty." Message received. Yet, despite her stoicism, she was not unfeeling. Many of her pupils cherished her, not merely as an instructor, but as a moral beacon. Some later became bishops, adjudicators, and governors. Notably, Cynesis of Cyrene, one of her most ardent students, subsequently became a Christian bishop, yet sustained his reverence for Hypatia throughout his life, composing letters to her that resembled a blend of fan correspondence, philosophical investigation, and spiritual counsel. She was not just a scholar. She was the embodiment of Alexandria's ancient spirit, scientific, philosophical, tolerant, and perilously brilliant in a world increasingly becoming intolerant. By the time Hypatia achieved her intellectual zenith, the Library of Alexandria, formerly the pinnacle of human erudition, was a mere shadow of its previous glory. The initial edifice had been razed through successive wars, disregard, and political turmoil. What endured was dispersed throughout the city. Annexes, scrolls concealed in private assortments, and a few academics still clinging to the aspiration of universal knowledge. Among these, none shone more brilliantly than Hypatia. Although she was not the formal librarian of the remnants, many regarded her as the de facto successor to that heritage. She revised and safeguarded significant mathematical documents, most notably treatises by Diophantus and Apollonius. Some scholars posit she even aided in designing the astrolabe and the hydrometer, instruments vital for astronomy and metrology. Indeed, she was not merely speculating about celestial bodies. She was instrumental in constructing the devices used for their observation. And then there was her exegesis on Ptolemy's Almagest, a sophisticated astronomical work filled with mathematically intensive models explaining planetary movement. Most individuals could not even articulate its title, let alone enhance it. But Hypatia's amendments rendered the work more comprehensible for subsequent generations, guaranteeing its persistence through time. Ironically, her revisions would become standard in Arabic translations centuries thereafter, long after the Roman world had forgotten her identity. But Hypatia was not accumulating knowledge. She believed in disseminating it unceasingly. Her classroom was any place she stood, whether illustrating parabolas or deconstructing Plato's forms. She never considered science and philosophy as distinct fields. To her, they were unified, the intellect and the cosmos, one immense interconnected system. Its conviction made her esteemed, but also susceptible. As Alexandria was transforming, Christian bishops were amassing power, temples were being repurposed into churches, and distrust of pagan learning was intensifying. Hypatia, a philosopher embedded in classical tradition, began to be perceived not merely as an instructor, but as a Manessa woman who taught astronomy instead of theology, who questioned rather than complied, who remained overtly unaffiliated with any religion. It mattered little that some of her students were Christians, or that she exhibited no overt animosity towards the church. What mattered was the symbolism. Hypatia epitomized the old world, one of reason and investigation, and in a city veering towards dogma, that was more perilous than any scroll by the early 5th century. Alexandria was no longer the tranquil cradle of learning it once aimed to be. It had become a crucible of religious animosity, political contention, and street-level aggression. Hypatia, willingly or not, had evolved into more than just a philosopher. She was now an emblem, and emblems tend to attract unruly crowds. The city's tension was almost tangible. On one side stood the pagan and intellectual elite, still clinging to the vestiges of Greco-Roman civilization. On the other, the burgeoning influence of Christianity, no longer a persecuted belief, but now an assertive, politically ascended power. And caught between them were Roman officials attempting to maintain order with the efficacy of a man trying to bail out the ocean, the newly appointed Christian bishop of Alexandria. Cyril was ambitious, powerful, and keen to establish the church's dominance over the city. His adversary was Orestes, the Roman governor, a Christian himself, but politically prudent and somewhat more accepting of Alexandria's traditional diversity. The two men detested each other, and in that seething cauldron of animosity, Hypatia inadvertently became a focal point. She commanded Orestes' respect, frequently acting as a reliable advisor. Yet, she remained resolutely neutral in religious matters, refusing conversion, refusing to choose a side, and refusing to vanish. In an era when neutrality was interpreted as disloyalty, this was problematic. The Christian populace, especially its more radical elements, began insinuating that Hypatia was the cause of the conflict between Orestes and Cyril, that she was employing enchantments, influencing politics with pagan sorcery, and impeding Alexandria's Christian destiny. It was, naturally, baseless. But when a city is intoxicated with fervor and bloodshed, baseless claims spread more rapidly than logic. Concurrently, a faction known as the Parabolanians, essentially religious enforcers, or monks, with physical prowess, were gaining sway under Cyril. Initially formed to care for the ill and enter the deceased, they increasingly resembled a paramilitary organization imposing church authority on the streets. Brilliant, autonomous, esteemed by Roman authority, conanly pagan in her philosophy, calmly navigating her chariot through town as if oblivious to the target on her back. But in Alexandria's new regime, no one remained above the fray for long. Cyril of Alexandria did not ascend to power with modest aspirations, taking over from his uncle Theophilus as bishop in 412 CE. Cyril inherited a church poised for dominance, and he harbored no desire to be merely a spiritual figurehead. He was a man who brandished theology like a broadsword and politics like a stiletto. In Alexandria, fractured by differing ideologies, provided the ideal arena for his campaign. Cyril's objective was twofold: to eradicate heresy and to establish the church's preeminence over secular governance. It wasted no time. He shuttered Novatian churches, banished Jews from the city, and broadened his sway over both the clergy and the common populace. His sermons did not just motivate, they incited action. He understood the potency of display, of conjoining divine discourse with physical might, and the Parabolani, that unofficial militant faction of the church, came his enforcers. Naturally, this did not sit well with Orestes, the imperial governor. Though a Christian, Orestes adhered to Rome's established policy of religious forbearance. He opposed Cyril's aggressive tactics, particularly those that encroached upon civil statutes. Their relationship deteriorated more swiftly than a stone, tumbling down temple steps. Orestes attempted negotiation. He attempted containment. What he received in response was aggression. When a Christian mob tried to assassinate him, pelting him with stones during a public oration, and one monk, Ammonius, was apprehended and executed for the assault. Cyril lauded him as a martyr. The schism had now become an exposed injury. Ensnared in this high-stakes power contest was Hypatia, respected by Orestes, disliked by Cyril's adherents, and impossible to disregard. She was not overtly political, but her intellect and influence rendered her a threat. Her very being undermined the notion that wisdom flowed exclusively through the church. A woman, a pagan, an astronomer, and a close confidant to Cyril's foremost political adversary. It was inconsequential that Hypatia possessed no army, no ambition for public office, In a city where theology and power were now inseparable, neutrality constituted the most perilous dance of all, and Cyril's silence regarding the escalating rumors against her would prove profoundly significant, because in Alexandria, when people begin accusing witches, it is merely a matter of time before someone ignites the flames. By 414 CE, Alexandria had transformed into a city where truth was no longer a prerequisite for condemnation. Only suspicion and a mob were needed. Hypatia, once lauded throughout the empire as a philosopher of unparalleled intellect, was now being depicted in more sinister hues by her adversaries. Rumors proliferated like a contagion that she was a sorceress, that she held Orestes captive, under her influence, that she was scheming against the church. None of this possessed any factual foundation, but facts had ceased to be in vogue. A significant portion of the propaganda against Hypatia exploited her public presence. She was a prominent figure, riding in her chariot, instructing openly, and conferring with high-ranking officials. Such self-assurance in a woman, no less, fronted the doctrinaire worldview, gaining traction among Alexandria's religious extremists. To them, Hypatia embodied everything amiss with the old order. She was female, philosophical, and resolutely unconverted. Whispers asserted she venerated demons, practiced dark enchantments, and that her astrolabes were magical devices employed to manipulate men's wills. In truth, they were merely scientific apparatuses. But science, in an era gripped by religious fanaticism, can appear very much like sorcery to those who fail to comprehend it or choose not to. One account even charged her with obstructing reconciliation between Orestes and Bishop Cyril. The reasoning was as follows. Hypatia advised Orestes. Orestes opposed Cyril. Pseudomy, therefore, Hypatia must be the origin of the discord. A neat, concise syllogism, convenient, elementary, and fatally erroneous. The streets seethed with disquiet. It was no longer a question of if something would befall Hypatia, but when and with what degree of violence. The Parabolani, formerly caregivers for the impoverished, had fully metamorphosed into zealots, eager for a cause. In the city's Christian majority, already conditioned to perceive Hypatia as a perilous pagan enchantress, required only the slightest signal to take action. That signal never came overtly from Cyril. He was too cautious for that, but his refusal to denounce the rumors, to pacify the widespread agitation, to publicly defend a woman he undoubtedly knew was blameless, spoke volumes. Silence, after all, is merely another form of communication. And so, the snare tightened slowly, imperceptibly around Hypatia, not with fetters, but with insinuations and accusatory gestures, the sort of confinement one never perceives until it is too late. It transpired in the spring of 415 CE. Hypatia, then in her mid-50s, still navigated her chariot through Alexandria's avenues, still instructed her pupils, and still dared to persist in defiance of the betrayal her adversaries had concocted. She likely perceived the peril. The looks had become menacing, the whispers more cutting, and the ambience heavy with threat. Yet she persevered, a living denunciation of fanaticism. And then, one day, they apprehended her. It was not a structured trial or an official execution. It was a mob frenzied, self-righteous, and overflowing with animosity, commanded by the Parabolani and purportedly incited by a man named Peter, a lector in the church. They intercepted her in the streets. She was forcibly removed from her chariot, divested of her attire, and dragged into a church edifice, a hallowed precinct, transformed into an abattoir. What ensued is challenging to recount without recoiling. Contemporary narratives, particularly that of the historian Socrates Scholasticus, state the mob assassinated her using roof tiles or oyster shells, stripping the flesh from her bones. Others assert they dismembered her body. What is certain is that after they killed her, they incinerated the remnants in additional affront, as if obliterating every vestige of her being would somehow render the act virtuous. It was a murder, not of policy, but of passions, the kind fueled by ideology, not legality. No trial, no verdict, just execution by fury. Alexandria lost more than a woman that day. It lost its final voice of classical tradition, its last public philosopher, and arguably its final claim to the cosmopolitan ethos that it once characterized it. Orestes was impotent to react. Cyril expressed regret, but disassociated himself from any culpability. There were no arrests, no public investigation. The silence that had preceded Hypatia's demise was succeeded by more silence, and then, progressively, by oblivion. But the harm was inflicted. With Hypatia's death, a symbolic portal slammed shut on antiquity's age of reason. It signified the termination of Alexandria as an intellectual hub and the commencement of its decline into theological inflexibility. Her mutilated form was the ultimate punctuation on centuries of gradual cultural decay. A scholar was slain. A world was extinguished in the weeks that followed Hypatia's savage killing. Alexandria became unnervingly still. Not because tranquility had been restored, but because something vital had perished. The avenues still teemed with activity. Churches still resonated with chants, right? And functionaries still affixed seals to scrolls. The city's essence, that unhindered exchange of ideas, that fusion of Greek philosophy, Roman administration, and Egyptian mysticism had been snuffed out permanently. Justice for Hypatia never materialized. No legal proceedings, no reparations. Orestes, already diminished, eventually vanished from historical accounts. Some suggest he departed Alexandria, too politically isolated to govern. Others claim he was summoned back to Rome. Regardless, the one influential figure who had attempted to protect her was no more, and Bishop Cyril. He emerged from the turmoil more powerful than ever. Although Cyril disavowed participation in her death, many interpreted his silence and rhetoric as implicit endorsement. He made no move to penalize the perpetrators. He never publicly decried the act. In due course, he was even declared a saint, Saint Cyril of Alexandria, remembered more for his struggles against heresy than for the philosopher whose blood had been spilled under his authority. As for Hypatia, her legacy was rapidly interred, not merely physically, but intellectually. Her name was expunged from numerous records. Her compositions were lost, her teachings ascribed to others. Her contributions to mathematics and astronomy dispersed throughout history with faint traces of her authorship. In the span of a historical moment, one of late antiquity's most luminous minds was reduced to a murmur, but murmurs persist. Centuries later, Hypatia's narrative began to re-emerge. First, in the works of Renaissance humanists who perceived in her a martyr for reason. Then in Enlightenment salons, where she became an emblem of intellectual liberty, quashed by dogma. By the 19th and 20th centuries, she was once again celebrated, the woman philosopher, the ultimate guardian of Alexandria's ancient erudition, a tragic figure whose demise signified the waning of classical civilization. Still, what we know of Hypatia today derives largely from the accounts of men, students like Siennesis, historians like Socrates, Scholasticus, and chroniclers from a later era attempting to reassemble a fragmented mosaic. The woman herself, her voice was silenced, but her silence became thunder. Despite the centuries of quiet, Hypatia resisted oblivion. Her name, once nearly obliterated, re-emerged in every era that challenged established power and cherished a quest for truth. She evolved beyond a mere historical personality. She became an emblem not solely of a murdered academic, but of a principle that reason must maintain its stance even when the world resorts to violence. During the Renaissance, intellectuals rediscovered her tale and venerated her as a victim of ignorance. In the Enlightenment, philosophers and skeptics cited Hypatia as evidence of the consequences when religion suppresses inquiry. Voltaire wrote of her with indignation, depicting her death as the conclusive blow to classical learning. She was portrayed as a tragic protagonist in dramas, verses, and subsequently, less often embellished, indeed, but invariably esteemed. In contemporary times, her story has motivated scientists, feminists, and secular thinkers alike. 2. Mathematicians. She represents one of the earliest documented women in the discipline, a precursor to those still advocating for representation in STEM fields today. 2 women in philosophy. She is an ancient trailblazer, one who not only engaged in intellectual pursuits, but also contributed to shaping them. And to humanists, she serves as a poignant reminder of knowledge's fragility when confronted by apprehension. Yet Hypatia's legacy extends beyond the symbolic. Though most of her written oeuvre has disappeared, scholars suspect her influence persists, embedded in the preservation of Greek mathematical texts. Her editions and commentaries likely formed the versions that permeated Arabic and, later, European scholarship. Thus, even in silence, her imprints remained on the instruments of learning. Therein lies a profound irony. The mob that dismembered her sought to annihilate not just the woman, but everything she represented. And yet, Hypatia endured, not in temples or churches, but in the intellects of generations who refused to let her name fade. Today, statues bear her likeness, educational institutions carry her name, and thinkers from all disciplines invoke her memory when the world begins to succumb to ignorance. She stands not merely as the final illumination of Alexandria, but as a challenge to each of us to articulate clearly, think audaciously, and never submit before the mob. Because truth, like Hypatia, may suffer, but it does not yield. Beneath a tranquil expanse of the Italian Alps, merely 30 meters from Turin, resides a secret that challenges credulity. It is not indicated on any ancient chart, nor promoted to sightseers. There are no Roman remnants, no medieval basilicas. Instead, concealed underneath the mountain hamlet of Adraco is an enormous hand-excavated subterranean complex, a labyrinth of hallowed chambers known as the temples of humankind. And for nearly 2 decades, no one outside a small spiritual fellowship even realized their existence. This is not some insignificant grotto with a smattering of murals. The temples extend across 5 tiers, interconnected by corridors, spiral stairways, quays, and cupolas that could compete with the architecture of grand cathedrals. They are adorned with sacred artistry, mosaics, stained glass, cosmic symbolism, and golden altars, all chiseled, painted, and installed manually. It is as if someone attempted to replicate the Sistine Chapel underground, then incorporated Egyptian hieroglyphs, Buddhist mandalas, Mayan inscriptions, and galactic charts for added effect. And who constructed it? Not the Vatican, not an esoteric fraternity with centuries of heritage. No, it was a relatively obscure spiritual collective calling themselves the Manor, named after the ancient Egyptian city believed to be the hub of Horus veneration. Established in 1975, the group envisioned a society founded on concord, self-reliance, and spiritual progression. The temples were their tangible embodiment of that aspiration, a sacred precinct intended to realign human consciousness with the cosmos. Construction commenced in 1978, led by Oberto Erodi, a former insurance agent turned mystic visionary, without authorization, without formal plans, and utilizing only manual implements. Erhudi and his adherents burrowed into the rock beneath a private dwelling. They labored nocturnally, used excavated soil for landscaping the hills, and informed no one. It was a form of spiritual defiance, constructing covertly what they believed could not be erected openly, and they succeeded for 17 years. No one surmised that behind the unassuming exterior of a countryside residence, a team of artists, engineers, and believers was carving a subterranean marvel. Not until a dissatisfied former member alerted the authorities in the 1990s in the Italian constabulary, anticipating a bunker or tax evasion scheme, confronted one of modern Europe's most astounding underground structures. The temples of humankind did not materialize from nothing. They were the outcome of a magnificent, highly unorthodox vision conceived in the intellect of a man named Oberda Eridu, Pudi, subsequently known to his adherents as Falco. In the 1970s, Eridu was not yet a spiritual guide. He held a rather conventional position as an insurance representative in northern Italy, but privately he was consumed by metaphysics, reincarnation, ancient societies, and what he termed the memory of the cosmos. Udi asserted that from an early age he experienced distinct past life recollections, not merely ill-defined feelings, but elaborate visions of existences in vanished civilizations, including Atlantis and ancient Egypt. He believed these memories were not mere fantasies, but actual blueprints. And one such blueprint, he stated, was for a temple not figurative, but tangible sanctuary for spiritual enlightenment, to be concealed subterraneanly and erected by a community unified in its objective. Thus, in 1975, he assembled a small contingent of like-minded individuals in the Alpine foothills. They shared his aspiration for a self-sufficient, spiritually advanced society. The group adopted the name Damanar after the Egyptian city, similarly named, believed to be the center of Horus worship and esoteric wisdom. Their aim was not to initiate a new religion, but to establish a novel form of society, one that harmonized science, art, ecology, and spirituality. Damanar expanded discreetly. Members relinquished their former lives to embrace communal existence in the Italian countryside. They engaged in meditation, sacred dance, and a fabricated language they believed improved communication on a refined plane. They instituted their own monetary system. They perused ancient writings and professed to converse with trees. To external observers, it all appeared charming at best, peculiar at worst. To followers, they were establishing the foundation for a cosmic regeneration. Beneath all this, however, lay the true secret. Construction had already commenced. Eridu claimed he had envisioned the temple and believed it was his destiny to build it, with picks, hammers, buckets, and unwavering conviction. Damanhurians started excavating, uncertain if they would ever complete it, or if they would be discovered. They were not merely digging into stone, they were digging into belief itself, and shaping a sanctuary intended not for the present, but for a future they believed was imminent from the exterior. The dwelling atop the hill in Vitraco appeared entirely unremarkable, just a simple alpine residence, situated quietly overlooking the valley, yet beneath its foundations, behind a clandestine hatch concealed by a rug, lay the entrance to an ever-expanding passage. It was here, under the cloak of darkness and quietude, that the people of Damanar embarked on what can only be termed an architectural marvel, constructing a vast subterranean temple by hand. Building commenced in 1978. There were no derricks, no excavators, no engineering crews in protective head gear, merely a small group of individuals with pickaxes, hammers, and lanterns. They tunneled into solid bedrock, using rudimentary tools, extracting the debris pail by pail, frequently laboring through the night to prevent discovery. The excavated soil was discreetly spread across the terrain, employed to form gardens and verandas, leaving no indication of the activities below. It was exceedingly perilous. The endeavor lacked official approval. There were no safety regulations. A single error could have precipitated a collapse, burying them alive. But the Damanhurians believed they were safeguarded by faith destiny and the council of superior intelligences. This was not mere construction. It was a hallowed rite. Every hammer strike constituted an act of devotion, Rudy, or Falco, asserted. He had already witnessed the temple in a vision. Every chamber, every corridor, every golden altar. His drawings directed the configuration, stones symbolizing various spiritual tenets, interconnected by passageways replete with art and illumination. Each chamber served a purpose: meditation, recuperation, energetic alignment. The architecture was dictated by sacred geometry and esoteric symbolism, not contemporary practicality. Even as additional members joined the undertaking, the secrecy remained intact. Families recounted tales of their offspring growing up playing above the temple floor, carelessly oblivious to what lay beneath their feet. Somehow, for almost 15 years, no neighbor reported unusual activities. No inquisitive locals inadvertently entered the wrong access point. No authority appeared at the door. By the early 1990s, they had carved out an underground expanse substantial enough to accommodate several levels of ornately adorned halls without a single external party's knowledge. It was an achievement of human tenacity, obsession, artistry, or perhaps all three combined. They were not merely constructing a temple. To the uninitiated observer, the temples of humankind might appear as an eclectic, artistic endeavor gone awry, a profusion of colors, symbols, and cosmic extravagance. Yet, to the Damanhurians, every single square inch possesses significance. This was not merely a sacred precinct, it was an apparatus for consciousness, a metaphysical instrument engineered to magnify spiritual energy, awaken dormant human capabilities, and realign humanity with the cosmos. At the heart of Damanhur's philosophy lies the conviction that Earth is traversed by synchronic lines, energetic currents, akin to ley lines or acupuncture meridians. These lines, they assert, link potent sites across the globe: the pyramids, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, and now the subterranean temples in Vidraco. The temples were not arbitrarily situated. They were deliberately constructed at the convergence of these lines, rendering them, in Damanhurian reasoning, a type of interdimensional power source. Each chamber within the temples embodies a distinct spiritual notion. The Hall of Water, for example, is dedicated to past existences and emotional recuperation. The Hall of Spheres is regarded as the temple's energetic core, a space intended for communication with higher intelligences and remote civilizations. No, not figuratively. Damanhurians genuinely believe that consciousness extends beyond Earth and that the temples function as a beacon. It is not merely symbolic. The community integrates sound, geometry, and material resonance into the architecture to activate these energies. Walls are embedded with copper coils. Quartz crystals are positioned to reflect frequencies. Every component, from hues to symbols to materials, is selected based on its resonance with human consciousness and planetary harmonics. Visitors frequently describe peculiar experiences, sensing waves of energy, hearing unexplained sounds, or entering modified states of awareness. Whether a placebo effect or an actual power grid, the temples do seem to exert an influence. Even skeptical scientists have observed unusually strong electromagnetic activity in certain chambers. But for the Damanhurian faithful, science merely corroborates what they already perceive. This is a living temple, one that interacts with intention, emotion, and thought. It serves as a conduit, not just between Earth and the stars, but between our current state and our potential future. In their view, the temples of humankind are not a relic of antiquity, but a prototype for what is to come, while the subterranean temples constitute the most visually stunning aspect of Damanhur. They represent only a single component of a far more extensive spiritual undertaking. Above ground, the Federation of Damanhur operates as a sort of deliberate micronation. complete with its own charter, currency, educational institutions, and even a unique timekeeping method. Indeed, they employed their own calendar, which commenced in 1975, the year the Federation was established. In the Manchurian chronology, we are currently in year 50-something. The community is structured into eco-villages, each serving a distinct function: agriculture, arts, research, healing, or temple maintenance. Daily existence merges the mystical with the ordinary. Inhabitants cultivate their own sustenance, engage in group meditations, convene for weekly social alchemy sessions aimed at harmonizing individual spiritual development with the group's collective advancement. At its zenith, the manor included over 1,000 members from more than 30 nations. Newcomers do not simply join informally. They undergo an initiation procedure and are encouraged to reside communally, relinquish some personal belongings, and apply their abilities to the collective. Professions span from sculptor to software engineer. Everyone is expected to contribute to the entirety. Education holds a significant role in the Manchurian life. Children are instructed not only in mathematics and language, but also in sacred geometry, ancient mythology, and energy perception. There is even a Manchurian university providing courses in esoteric sciences, spiritual physics, and alternative healing practices. It resembles Hogwarts, equipped with solar panels. You are not far from the mark. It's at the philosophical core of it all is the notion that divinity permeates all things, and that humanity's aim is to awaken to its function as a co-creator with the universe. This entails living in harmony with nature, exploring consciousness, and utilizing creativity as a spiritual instrument. To outsiders, the community might appear eccentric, even cult-like, but there is no single deity, no enforced doctrine, and no charismatic autocrat. Leadership is democratic, and roles are rotational. Members are at liberty to depart, and many, do critics exist? Some former members mention internal pressures, ideological inflexibility, or exhaustion. Yet even critics concede it is unlike anything else on earth. The manor is not merely a commune or a spiritual haven. It is an ongoing societal experiment, a place where people earnestly endeavor to live a myth. Not just peruse one dot. To traverse the temples of humankind is to step into a cosmos constructed from symbols. Every partition, ceiling, and floor is imbued with layers of significance: mythological, mathematical, cosmological. But the manor does not perceive art as simple adornment. Here, art functions as sacred technology, an instrument to awaken the spirit, unlock ancient recollections, and commune with the divine without uttering a single syllable. Their artistic style is not haphazard. It interweaves Egyptian iconography, Celtic spirals, Hindu deities, and futuristic stellar charts. One chamber might feature the Eye of Horus, while another displays stylized DNA helices or planetary conjunctions. These are not merely attractive designs, they are purposeful codes. Manchurians believe these symbols address the soul's vernacular, circumventing the rational intellect and activating profounder awareness. But why amalgamate so many cultures and traditions? According to their doctrines, all myths are components of a vaster universal truth narratives, conveyed in diverse tongues, all indicating the same cosmic origin. The temples do not profess to replicate any single religion. Instead, they aim to harmonize them all, not in a featureless amalgamation, but as a deliberate assimilation of human spiritual heritage. Then there is the matter of language, or rather, languages. The manor formulated its own sacred tongue, termed sacred language, not highly inventive, but precise. It comprises thousands of ideograms, each crafted to articulate spiritual concepts that ordinary speech purportedly fails to encompass. These glyphs are found carved into stone and glass throughout the temples, gleaming in gold leaf, etched into colored marble, hovering above doorways like luminous incantations. To the community, These symbols are not invented. They are recalled. Falco asserted that this language originates from ancient civilizations preceding our documented history, possibly even from extraterrestrial sources. In other words, the symbols are less created and more retrieved. Like spiritual fossils from an earlier, more sagacious era, visitors often describe the experience within the temples as emotional, even overwhelming. Many weep. Some report a peculiar sense of recognition, as if remembering something long forgotten, and that is precisely the intention. The temples are not designed to explicate, they are designed to elicit. Because in the manner, truth is not imparted. It is awakened through story, symbol. In the quietude between expressions, the temples of humankind were never intended as memorials to antiquity. They were, and remain, a design for the future, not merely a spiritual future, but a cultural one where architecture, consciousness, and community meld into something novel. While the world above accelerates with technology and discord, the realm beneath Vidraco continues to develop gradually, purposefully, one brush application at a time. Even presently, the temples are incomplete. Titian, the manner views them as a living entity, perpetually transforming. New chambers are incorporated, existing ones are refurbished, murals are retouched, and fresh symbols are added to mirror the community's evolving energy. Unlike conventional sacred locations preserved in stasis, the temples of humankind respire, mature with the individuals who constructed them. In the years following their discovery, the manor has broadened its international presence. The Federation now encompasses centers in additional countries, online educational programs, and a flow of global visitors who arrive for spiritual retreats, energy healing, or simple inquisitiveness. While some anticipate New Age superficiality, many depart profoundly impacted, necessarily converted, but stirred by the sheer ambition of the site. After all, how many communities actually erect cathedrals from inception, underground, in secrecy? Yet, the manor is not devoid of detractors. Skeptics question some of its assertions. Past lives, synchronic lines, interstellar communication. Others express concern about its cult-like fervor or the level of commitment demanded from members. But throughout all this, the Federation has persisted, not by secluding itself, but by making its gates accessible. Today, the temples stand as a symbol of potential, what can be achieved when art, intention, and community unite. They serve as a reminder that the great sacred sites of the ancient world, the pyramids, cathedrals, the ziggurats, were not merely edifices. They were manifestations of collective conviction. Kaner dares to inquire, why did we cease constructing in that manner? And perhaps that constitutes the legacy of the temples of humankind, not their beliefs, but their audacity, teed in a world fixated on efficiency and spectacle. A group of ordinary individuals resolved to delve into the earth and fashion something sacred by hand, in silence, for the sake of beauty and spirit. It is not just a temple. It is a question etched into stone. What are you forging with your existence? Long before satellites circled Earth or mariners exclaimed land ahoy, human beings were already in motion, charting coastlines, traversing deserts, and inscribing their conceptions of the world onto clay, stone, or animal skin. Travel was not merely about inquisitiveness, it concerned survival. The very earliest explorers were not thrill seekers. They were foragers and merchants, hunters and displaced persons. But over time, movement evolved beyond necessity. It became strategy, and eventually, it transformed into legacy. The initial maps were not elaborate cartographic achievements. They were incised patterns on cavern walls, engravings on bones, or mental representations passed down through speech. Around 2300 BCE, the Babylonians etched one of the first known maps onto a clay tablet not of the entire world, but of a single region delineated with rivers, settlements, and mountains. To them, the earth was a flat disk encircled by a cosmic ocean, with Babylon, naturally, at its core. It lacked geographical precision, but it mirrored something even more significant: purpose. These individuals desired to comprehend their environment. They wished to navigate. But how does one travel without roadways, signage, or celestial charts? You observe the sun, you study the stars, you commit to memory the terrain, animal migrations, and wind directions. And if fortunate, you transmit that knowledge to someone who retains it better than you. Ancient Polynesians, for instance, perfected navigation using ocean undulations, bird flight trajectories, and constellation positions. Meanwhile, traders in Mesopotamia followed riverine paths like the Tigris and Euphrates, transforming seasonal inundations into shipping thoroughfares. In these nascent civilizations, travel was seldom solitary. It was communal, unhurried, and frequently perilous. Travelers faced risks from bandits, tempests, disease, and simply becoming irretrievably lost. Yet, they also transported goods, languages, concepts, and technologies across regions. Trade routes started to emerge like arteries across the ancient world's corpus. Exploration did not require reaching new continents to be transformative. Sometimes it sufficed to reach the adjacent city-state, the next oasis, the subsequent fertile valley. Those minute advancements forged the web of interaction that would ultimately constitute civilization itself. So, when we discuss ancient exploration, we are not merely referring to distant voyages. We are addressing a fundamental human drive to ascertain what lies beyond the horizon and to leave an imprint on the uncharted. The ancient Egyptians were not renowned for extensive wanderings, but when they did journey, they executed it with panache, ceremony, and often an armed contingent. The Nile served as their thoroughfare, and it was not solely for leisurely excursions. Pharaohs dispatched expeditions southward to Nubia, eastward into the Sinai, and even farther into enigmatic territories like Punt, a semi-legendary kingdom Egyptians termed God's Land. Its precise location remains contested. Somalia, Eritrea, southern Arabia. No one is entirely certain. However, what is definite is that Egyptians sent vessels there laden with merchandise and supplications, aspiring to return with incense, gold, exotic fauna, and a sense of divine imminence. One of the most celebrated documented expeditions transpired during the reign of Queen Hatshepsut, Egypt's formidable female pharaoh, around 1478 BCE. She initiated a voyage to Punt and proudly chronicled the journey on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahr. The carvings portray massive ships, men transporting myrrh trees, and indigenous people with distinctive features and ornate headdresses. This was not merely commerce, it was diplomacy, propaganda, and spiritual alignment consolidated. Leans also ventured into the Sinai Peninsula, not just for subjugation, but to extract turquoise and copper. These expeditions frequently involved hundreds of laborers, scribes, soldiers, and priests. Travel was state-endorsed and meticulously recorded. Tiros were not dispatching lone adventurers. They were deploying logistical apparatuses. Officials documented everything: what was mined, who participated, the quantity of offerings presented to the gods to guarantee a safe passage. Despite being encircled by deserts, Egypt was not isolated. Caravans traversed the western desert, linking oases and importing goods from as distant as Libya. Sea travel, though perilous, facilitated contact with Byblus, Crete, and other eastern Mediterranean ports. But be assured, ancient Egyptian travel was not effortless. Whether by land or vessel, expeditions were protracted, hazardous, and expensive. Yet, they were perceived as vital extensions of divine decree. When the pharaoh moved, Egypt moved, and every journey reinforced their worldview that Egypt was the universe's center, and everything else, whether ally, adversary, or alien, existed to be known, subdued, or revered. For them, exploration was not defiance against the gods. It was servitude to them. If ancient Egypt directed its focus inward towards its river and deities, the Phoenicians were the ones gazing out across the sea and constructing vessels to pursue the horizon. Rising around 1500 BCE from the coastal, urban centers of Byblus, Tyre, and Sidon in contemporary Lebanon, the Phoenicians did not conquer territory. They conquered water, and in doing so, they became the ancient world's most audacious navigators and merchants. They were not an empire in the conventional meaning, no immense armies, no imposing ziggurats. But they established something arguably more remarkable: a network. The Phoenicians created trade routes that spanned the Mediterranean from the Levant to North Africa, to Cyprus, Sicily, Spain, and even to the enigmatic periphery of the Atlantic at the Strait of Gibraltar. En route, they founded cities, the most renowned being Carthage, which would subsequently challenge Rome itself. What facilitated their success? Boats, sleek, swift, and resilient. Phoenician ships were the marvels of their era. They employed a combination of oars and sails, with high hulls for safeguarding and curved designs that sliced through waves. These were not merely transport craft, They were floating emporiums laden with cedar wood, glassware, textiles dyed with their celebrated purple pigment, and alphabetic script carved into stone and traded like advanced technology. Yes, the Phoenicians also bequeathed to us one of the greatest instruments for human connection, the alphabet. Their script, streamlined writing, transitioning from cuneiform and hieroglyphs to a system of just 22 characters, subsequently influenced Greek, Latin, and eventually our modern alphabets. But travel for the Phoenicians was not without danger. Pirates infested the waters. Storms could shatter ships into fragments, and every new harbor introduced the risk of hostile locals or commercial rivalry. Still, they persevered, not as conquerors, but as connectors. They imported tin from Britain, silver from Iberia, papyrus from Egypt, and spices from Arabia. Some sources, including Herodotus, even assert that Phoenician mariners under Egyptian patronage circumnavigated Africa as early as the 6th century BCE. That is a daring assertion. But if anyone in the ancient world could have accomplished such a feat, it was likely the Phoenicians. They did not erect monuments. They established routes, and in doing so, charted the core of the ancient world through wind, wave, and commerce, while Mediterranean mariners navigated waves and traded between city-states. Far to the east, a different type of journey was in progress, slower, dustier, and equally transformative. In ancient China, travel did not signify ships upon the sea. It meant caravans, traversing deserts, meandering through mountains, and confronting some of the most challenging terrain on earth. This marked the inception of what we now term the Silk Road, an extensive network of overland paths connecting East Asia with the Middle East, Central Asia, and ultimately Europe. Its beginnings date back to the Han Dynasty around the 2nd century BCE, when Emperor Wu of Han dispatched an envoy named Zhang Qian westward to forge alliances against nomadic aggressors. Zhang Qian failed in this diplomatic endeavor, but in the process, unintentionally discovered entire civilizations beyond China's western boundary. He returned years later with accounts of Persian merchandise, Central Asian steeds, and exotic cultures. The emperor was not pleased about the postponement, but was intrigued by the prospects. Trade routes flourished. Chinese merchants began exporting silk, lacquerware, spices, jade, and porcelain products so coveted they became status symbols. From India to Rome. In exchange, caravans brought back horses, glassware, wool, and gold. Yet, it was not solely goods that traveled. Ideas, technologies, and religions crossed frontiers. Buddhism migrated from India into China. Artistic styles converged. Musical instruments were exchanged. Even paper, invented in China, would eventually make its way west, revolutionizing written communication. But Silk Road travel was arduous. Caravans crossed the Taklamakan Desert, nicknamed the place from which no one returns. Sandstorms could engulf travelers. Bandits lurked in remote passes. In the sheer distance thousands of miles from Chang'an modern Xi'an, cities like Samarkand or Antioch would take months or even years. Travelers depended on oases, where small trading cities thrived like verdant jewels in the desert. Dunhuang, Kashgar, Merv. No single empire governed the entire road. It was sustained by a patchwork of kingdoms, tribes, and city-states, each maintaining a segment of the route and levying taxes on what passed through. And yet, despite its intricacy, it functioned, creating a web of connection that reshaped the ancient world. The Silk Road was not a solitary track. It was a circulatory system, infusing life, belief, and ambition across continents, while deserts, rivers, and seas presented significant challenges to ancient voyagers. The Persian Empire adopted a distinct strategy. They constructed roads long, resilient, or kept roads land, not merely for the purpose of moving armies or commodities. For the Achaemenid Persians, roads constituted the very framework of empire, a method to integrate a mosaic of subjugated lands, languages, and cultures into a singular, unified system. Central to this vision was the Royal Road, commissioned by Darius the Great in the 5th century BCE, extending over 1,500 miles from Susa in Persia to Sardis near the Aegean Sea. This highway linked the empire from east to west, permitting couriers, merchants, and military officers to cover vast distances with unprecedented swiftness. Owing to a network of relay stations equipped with fresh horses and provisions, royal messengers could traverse the entire route in merely 7 to 9 days, a remarkable feat for that era. For context, the average traveler or caravan would require approximately 3 months. But the road was not only rapid, it was also secure. Patrols, fortifications, and outposts guaranteed safety for those journeying under the king's authority. Travelers from across the empire, from Babylonian scribes to Greek diplomats, utilized the royal road not only to transport goods, but also to disseminate ideas, rumors, and political information. In many respects, it evolved into the empire's information superhighway. The Persian Empire's road system extended beyond the royal road, connecting cities like Ecbatana, Persepolis, and Babylon, and reaching out towards Egypt, India, and Central Asia. Staging posts, called caravanserais, provided rest and supplies for weary merchants and travelers. These structures would later become vital components of Islamic and Silk Road travel centuries thereafter. More than just infrastructure, Persian roads symbolized the empire's ambition to unify its diverse components, not through coercion alone, but through interconnectedness. By standardizing coinage, weights, and languages employed for official communication, the Persians facilitated interaction, trade, and participation in the imperial economy. In a world where most movement was slow and disorganized, Persia offered something revolutionary: order, structure, and a system designed for long-distance travel. In essence, the Persians did not just govern an empire, they engineered it. Greeks were not empire constructors in the conventional sense, at least not initially. What they possessed, however, was immense curiosity. From Herodotus to Pythias, Greek travelers explored the ancient world, pursuing knowledge, commerce, and sometimes simply sheer amazement. Exploration for them was not invariably about subjugation. It was a method to pose inquiries, gather narratives, and chart the unknown. One of the earliest and most captivating explorers was Pythias of Massalia, modern Marseille. around 325 BCE, sailed beyond the recognized world through the Straits of Gibraltar, the Atlantic coast, and purportedly all the way to an enigmatic northern land he named Thule. Many scholars believe he might have reached Iceland or Norway. He described peculiar phenomena like the midnight sun and frozen seas, things Mediterranean readers considered mythical. But Pythias was not a fabricator of myths. He was a scientist with a mariner spirit. Meanwhile, in the eastern Mediterranean, Greek merchants and philosophers journeyed across Egypt, Persia, and India. Alexander the Great's campaigns in the 4th century BCE dramatically expanded the Greek world, ushering in the Hellenistic era, where Greek became a common language from Athens to Bactria. Cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Seleucia transformed into crossroads for goods and ideas. Travel ceased to be an anomaly. It became an expectation. Then arrived the Romans, the engineers of empire. The Romans took travel and literally paved it with their renowned road system. They connected cities across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. At its zenith, the Roman Empire featured over 250,000 miles of roads, including more than 50,000 miles of stone-paved highways. Roads like the Via Appia, constructed in 312 BCE, were marvels of engineering designed for longevity, and many still exist today. Roman roads primarily served the military, enabling legions to move swiftly to suppress rebellions, but they also facilitated commerce, postal services, pilgrimages, and even tourism. Wealthy Romans visited Greek temples, Egyptian pyramids, and spa towns in Gaul. Guidebooks and travel accounts became popular literature. To the Romans, travel was not merely practical, it was a statement. Roads demonstrated the empire's extent. If a road led to your town, it signified your importance. And with every mile laid in stone, Rome reshaped the ancient world's perception of distance and connection, while terrestrial routes like the Silk Road conveyed caravans through deserts and mountains. Another network, equally extensive and ancient, spanned the waters of the Indian Ocean. These were the maritime silk routes, linking ports from East Africa to India, from the Arabian Peninsula to Southeast Asia, long before the era of large sailing ships. Mariners were navigating monsoon winds, traversing enormous distances and transforming the ocean into a global emporium. The crucial element, monsoon winds, predictable seasonal currents that reverse course each half year. Ancient seafarers learned to synchronize their voyages with these winds, heading eastward when they blew from Africa and westward when they reversed. With this knowledge, ships could reliably cross the open ocean, undertaking voyages that once appeared unachievable. Indian merchants sailed from Gujarat and the Tamil coast, exporting spices, textiles, gemstones, and ivory. In return, they imported horses, incense, gold, and even exotic animals. Arab traders from ports like Aden and Oman transported goods to and from the Persian Gulf, while East African merchants in locations like Rapta traded ivory and tortoiseshell. Chinese vessels, particularly during the Han and later Tang dynasties, also participated, exporting silk, ceramics, and lacquerware. By the 1st century CE, Greek and Roman ships were arriving in Indian ports such as Barigaza and Muziris, completely bypassing overland routes. A Roman-era guidebook, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, describes in detail the bustling trade ports, exchanged goods, and routes followed by sailors across the Indian Ocean. This was not conjecture. It was a manual for navigating global commerce. But the sea was not merely a place of trade. It was also a conduit for ideas. Buddhism spread from India to Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia via maritime routes. Islamic traders later carried their faith across the Indian Ocean, shaping entire coastal cultures in East Africa and the Malay world. Unlike the often militarized overland empires, The Indian Ocean Trade Network thrived on pluralism and cooperation. Ports became melting pots of language, religion, and cuisine. Kano merchant, a Swahili sailor, a Yemeni imam, and a Chinese diplomat could all conduct business in the same harbor. In this ancient sea, the tides did not just carry ships, they carried civilizations.